talk to me, I don't believe a word. Don't try to make me feel
All right. Hey, man. Welcome back. This is American Reckoning podcast. I think we're up to episode 13. I am Paul. He's Aaron. So thanks for chiming in. We've been gone a little bit, but we're back. And we're talking about conservative talk radio and some conservative, I'm going to put the big quotes up, so-called conservative talk radio and media. That's the topic of this show. So we're going to get into that a little bit. And so thanks again. Remember, we're on YouTube and Rumble. So make sure that you like or comment us. That really goes a long way, I guess. Even though I'm almost positive we're getting censored, at least on YouTube. Yeah. And hey, by the way, just to inform you, we also got kicked off of X or Twitter or whatever it is. So we have to look into that. I just noticed that today, but we'll see.
Hopefully that's an administrative problem.
It could be, but I sent a note just to go, hey, what's going on?
But they couldn't have done it honestly for lack of activity or anything like that.
Well, it could be because we don't use it. I haven't said anything even remotely, controversial or anything. Right, yeah. So I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. But yeah, so, I'm going to list some names here and they're off the top of my head. So feel free to chime in, but some of the so-called conservative talk radio, and I'll list some names and then we're going to talk about a little bit about why we think the field of play that conservatives are playing on is really a Marxist, it's left-wing stuff that's left over from, basically from 1865 when the war between the states ended, and the Republican Party at that time, the party of Lincoln, the great emancipator, the greatest president, the 16th president in somebody's eyes that has a giant monument in Washington, D.C. Why the Republicans use him as one of their great leaders, their great icons, their great symbol of presidential republicanism and all this stuff, and why we think that's a load of crap. And we'll try to go through as to why. So I just heard it. I don't know if it was this morning or yesterday, but sometimes I pick up that guy, Chris Plante, in the Washington, D.C. area. And again, a lot of these conservatives, we kind of agree on many, many of their points, except when they start defending the modern Republican Party and they kind of go after the Democrats and they say the Democrats are the party of Jim Crow and racist, and they have a history of racism and Jeff Davis and the Confederacy and blah, blah, blah. He goes off. And so Chris Plante is one that tops my list. He's from Michigan, so he's obviously not even a Southerner, and he doesn't pretend to be. I'm just saying he comes from it from a totally different perspective, and we'll explain why. But people like Mark Levin, people like even Sean Hannity on Fox News,
Dennis Prager,
people like Dan Bongino, even. Yeah. Who has pretty fiery guy and everything, and I think he appreciates things in the South, but he's also one of those that's just hardcore Republican,
right?
In the modern sense, which is really the only way to be, because the modern Republican Party hasn't changed since 1865, and so we'll get into that. Glenn Beck. Who else? Who else am I missing?
We'll probably think of a couple more. There are more out there. And I'll say everybody, you and I have just listed so far, by and large, I enjoy their commentary. I do find value in it, and I think they're right about a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to these people, aren't historians. They're not really interested in history. And this is kind of one of my points, which I'm sure I'll come back to.
They're political, is what you're saying.
Right. They are trying to project for political, tactical reasons of today, the modern understanding of Republican versus Democrat, and they try and project it onto the past, and it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all.
Right.
And anyway, more to come on that front.
Yeah, no, and I mean we should talk about that a little bit more, because that's really the gist of the issue that we have with them, and a lot of people coming from the Confederate point of view, and everything Confederate is being thrown in the trash.
Right.
All of the people, all of the ancestral part of that, the legacy of the South, the culture, the history, the heritage. That's why we have this show. I mean, that's the basis of the show. We tie it to an American reckoning, because we feel that as this gets taken away, they're coming after that. That's why Republicans are fighting and losing, and they will always lose, is because they're not tethered to what's really the problem is. And the politics, and this is the biggest thing, and we'll get in. I'm sorry, I don't want to digress already, but we'll get into this because they feel that the Democrat Party now, they know it's left wing, they know it's liberal or left wing, whatever, and they're a bunch of loons and all kinds of stuff. But what they don't understand is that the Democrat Party pre 1861, or really 1865, as it barely held on, if you will, died in 1865. The real Democrat Party was the conservative party. It was Jeffersonian, it was conservative, states' rights, all that stuff. We'll talk about Texas and how all of a sudden Republicans support Texas. That was the actual secession. You know, people talking about secession today. What do you think the Confederates were talking about when they decided to pick up arms and create a whole new liberty people? They wanted the central government, the central authority. And so that's what the Republicans today are defending.
Yeah.
The Democrat Party died. So what do you think?
Yeah. Just a couple little points on that. Yeah. I mean, you and I are old enough to remember something that still existed in the 1990s called the Conservative Coalition. And that was a coalition primarily of conservative Republicans at the time and Southern conservative Democrats, which still existed. Obviously, in the 1960s, the Democrat Party started to go even further left, even more radical.
Right.
But people forget that, indeed, the Democrats were very conservative going back then, and they don't resemble at all what they are today. Following the so-called Civil War, by about 30 or 40 years, you had the progressive movement, and both Republicans and Democrats at that time were trying. I kind of skipped over a few decades there. It's kind of
I get it.
But both parties were very liberal. The Republicans originally being a 19th century leftist party, which essentially it still is. Which for those of us who consider ourselves conservative and have voted for Republicans in our lives and continue to do so by and large, they don't realize that. A lot of Republicans, conservative today, think Republicans started out as some type of conservative party. It was not. It was actually a more radical party. And following the war, the progressive movement started, like I said, a few decades after, and around the turn, around 1900, you had a lot of very prominent progressives at the time. They called themselves progressive, and exactly what that means is kind of in line with today, though there are modern progressives, like Hillary Clinton calls herself a modern progressive. But basically, both parties were kind of fighting over who was going to be the progressive party. And the original Progressive Party was actually an offshoot of the Republican Party.
It's such a great point. Yeah.
It didn't last very long.
And then in the early 20th century with leading up to Wilson, it seemed, did it shift to
a lot of this was proximate to Wilson. But yeah, they kind of went back and forth, and without getting into too much detail, FDR and, with the New Deal and that kind of thing, basically kind of won it out on the Democrats, ended up being the Progressive Party then, even though there were still a lot of people who were Democrats by party affiliation, but were conservative in a very traditional way. So that needs to be understood as well. There was always, and most of those were in the South. And furthermore, Republicans really couldn't get elected in the South, even, by the time of FDR. And they were,
Right.
and the Republicans, just by name, as a legacy of the so-called Civil War, were so disliked in the South, which is why you had so many of these conservative Democrats existing up through the 1960s and even as late as the 1990s.
Right.
And so this modern R versus D, which is what the modern political commentators are trying to do, is they're
Right.
trying to
Because
say
it's political. Because it's
the
political.
Republicans have always been good and they've always been
Yeah.
conservative, and the Democrats have always been bad and they've always
Bad.
been
Yeah.
on the left, and that is completely untrue. And the problem is, that's too complicated a message to get across.
It's hard for people to wrap their heads around.
Well, and
I
these
wish
people
I
aren't
wish it could-
historians. They're not
they're not.
historians.
They're-
And
they're-
they are
and that's the
political
problem.
tacticians.
They're
Their
political
job
yeah.
is to promote a conservative Republican agenda with which I don't disagree most of the time. It's just when they get into
like maybe 90, 85, 90,
Yeah.
maybe as much as 95%.
Sure, yeah.
But then
it's-
when they go talking about the South, it start talking about the Democrat versus Republican, the R versus D thing,
Mhm, yep.
and they start going back to the Civil War, they just fall apart. They're not true conservatives, and they call themselves conservatives. It is a complete whitewash.
Yeah.
It's, well, if nothing else, it's a total obfuscation of what is true, even in a political sense. But they have, the thing is that they're dying. The Republican Party, I mean, unless Trump wins,
Yeah.
the modern Republican Party, and really Trump, to be honest with you, he's the default vote for anybody who's in remotely. I mean,
well, and for whatever good Trump can bring, it's probably going to be over as soon as he is. Even a lot of people that support him don't have his clout. They don't have his gravitas. They don't have his resources. They don't have the game that he does. And so they might, but Trump wants to make it like the 1980s. He wants to make it like a prosperous Reagan era thing, which under the circumstances, I think is a good thing. But keep in mind, he's not trying to go back and reinterpret originalism. He's a prosperity guy. He's one of those prosperity Republicans, which is a good thing. But again, it doesn't do anything to fix the historical misunderstandings that will continue to be perpetuated.
Yeah. And the way I kind of explain it too is, the way I've thought about it, and I've heard other people explain it. He talked about Donald Livingston. Is it Donald Livingston?
Don Livingston, yeah.
Don Livingston. Yep. Yeah. He described it as the Republicans and Democrats playing on a plane, on a linear plane.
Yeah.
And you have the far left, Democrats today, which are basically almost communists. There are no more moderate Democrats. This thing has fallen way off the board.
Yeah, sure.
And then you have Republicans, which are supposedly on the right, but really they're playing on the same linear plane. They don't realize that there's an entire y-axis plane that feeds into this.
Right.
And that, unfortunately, it only exists in time and space, and it doesn't exist today because it died in 1865, 1861.
Yep.
So you're really, these guys are playing on the same football field with the left goalpost and the right goalpost. I mean, another way to look at it is your suspended animation is football field in time and space, and that's all that's being argued. All the other suborbital whatever, around that field don't get to play on that space.
Right.
And so the old Democrat,
if you think about the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln was a leftist party. It was radical for the time. Guys like Karl Marx supported it. Karl Marx wrote twice a week for the New York Tribune, which was a Republican newspaper. And Greeley was highly supportive of
Horace Greeley,
of Lincoln, and in fact,
Charles Dana, the publisher, all of these guys were steep Republicans. I mean, we've pointed out, I think in the last podcast we talked about, and others have pointed this out, and starting to see it, that a lot of the Union generals in Lincoln's army were Marxists. They were coming from Germany. They were coming from these 1850s where this is already being The revolutions were already occurring in those countries, and so those people emigrated over here, and they just try to recreate this.
Yeah, they were proto-Marxist. I mean, Marx was still around, but they were, and including Lincoln, they were kind of in favor of this kind of thing.
And you'll never hear, because it's political, but they wouldn't dare tell the truth about the real Lincoln, the real facts about the voracious desire of the radical Republicans, who not only wanted to go to war against the Southerners, against the Southern states for seceding. And enough with this crap about slavery and racism and all this other crap. That's a false narrative. It's a lie. They wanted the power that went with it. They wanted to combine. They wanted to combine these industries, the railroads, the canals, all of this infrastructure. You hear it a lot today. Even modern Republicans, they throw down so much friggin' of our money. Well, over wars and everything. That is how they exist. That is the perpetual state of crap that they push, and both parties do it. And so,
both parties are basically playing. Basically, you had these. The Republican Party is, because seriously, you vote for them so many times, and you wonder, why don't they do a damn thing they say? Well, and one of the reasons is because fundamentally they are a 19th century leftist party. So what does that mean? That means basically they kind of believe in the revolution. They kind of believe in the socialist revolution. They just believe it kind of had a limit, and and it went as far as it should go, and that's where it stops. And whereas your modern, liberal socialist Democrat, being radical, believe that the revolution basically never stops. And so that's the only difference. So they basically are, and I know it's really tough for people who are conservative and vote Republican get their heads around this, because I used to listen to conservative talk radio all the time. Until I got older and learned more history.
I still find myself listening to it. I just kind of like, oh my gosh, when they start talking about. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry,
but you're absolutely right. They have to engage in that narrative, because again, their job isn't to portray history accurately. Their job is to be political commentators.
And people listening in the areas where they think they're listening to real conservatism, this great, the Republicans are the last stand. We have this side and our, whatever. And I hate to tell you, people,
it's not a small government party. That's the reason why. And so that's why there's this. I mean, it's not a split, but there's always been this side, this big. And obviously, there have been major events throughout the 20th century that required a pretty big response, and that's why we're all used to it today. You had World War II. I mean, you could say World War I, but World War II is the big one, and then the Cold War, and these required big kind of. Even if they weren't centralized as they were, they would have required very centralized coordination to respond to.
Right.
But that's the point.
And that brings up
off this century of nationalism, which we all realize had some necessity, really. But then we wonder where our states' rights are. We wonder how this administrative state became so overblown, and why it's so difficult to reassert. It's because these institutions have been around for 100 years.
Yeah, they've had time to really, not only from being taught in the public schools and through businesses and through our whole way of life. But if you look around you, you see the ills of society growing and those traditional values that the old Democrats, now the antebellum and all that. But I mean, that's how those things are few and far between, just barely hanging on, if they even are anymore. But all of that you can blame on this push towards everything that we do belonging to the state, belonging to both parties, and there's no other choice. Belonging to that kind of society. But that's how America is, and it's, it's pretty sad to see. It's pretty, but that's hard to explain. To people who are banking on someone like Trump, for example. And then nothing against Trump. I mean, I'd probably have to vote for him because there's no other choice. Because you're trying to stop as a citizen, trying to stop this complete complete turn to Marxism, which you see happening. And I cannot believe how people are lapping this stuff up like a bunch of Pavlov dogs.
Yeah.
And it's like, what are you doing? And now after that, you don't realize that again, we've talked about all the Confederate monuments, Confederate historical heritage, people, whatever. Once that goes, who do you think they're going to come after next?
Right.
You don't think even Abraham Lincoln's statue sitting there smug on his giant chair over the Lincoln Memorial and the reflecting pool, you don't think that's going to go away? Man, I got another thing coming for you.
Yep. No one's going to believe it till it happens. No one is going to believe it till it happens.
They're going to sit there and it'll be too late. They'll sit there in deer in headlights, and you have all these patriotic people. And granted, I've got we've all talked about this. You've served in the wars over the years, World War I, World War II, on and on and on, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. So they all, and all the other little episodes too. It's not just those, all this covert crap that we do and spend a god-awful amount of money by pouring 80 or 90 billion dollars like it was freaking candy.
We should
refer to a place like Ukraine.
We should refer, excuse me, sorry to interrupt, but I'm saying we should refer to billions as thousands of millions.
Yes.
So
people can't even get their head around that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so far gone, man. It's it's really, really sad. And
we're giving.
And if only these people, you're crying in the wilderness. If anybody could just wake up, or maybe they're all drones and it's over. They've got a chip planted in their brain. I don't freaking know, but they just can't see what is happening. And I know people feel it, but they can't
identify it.
They can't identify it. And I know, yes, if we start looking in a biblical sense, there's, God's going to take care of this anyway. But, for those of us who have a discerning mind between right and wrong, and understand what true patriotism is, and it really kind of falls back into the basics. And that's what true conservative is. What happened in the beginning? The originalists. Why did we get the Constitution? You start looking at some of these things in totality, not just from a political sense, and it will open your eyes.
Yeah, so. I think to your point there, that's a lot of people who think they're conservatives, primarily as I do, and probably as you do, and many of our friends and people with whom we work and associate, who consider themselves conservatives.
We also consider ourselves just plain Americans,
Well, that's the thing. Well, and so what does America mean, though? So they probably consider themselves originalists, because you were talking about that, getting back to originalism. And that's the problem with the Lincoln side of things, is Lincolnism is not originalism. You can't go back to the founding area in any real meaningful way, unless you're talking about exclusively Alexander Hamilton and guys like John Marshall, who were actively trying to exacerbate this from the beginning. But yeah, when you talk about Jefferson, and when you talk about George Mason, and you talk about the Bill of Rights, and you talk about all these things that everybody was worried about with the creation of the federal government, it went the wrong way with Lincoln. And that's the reason why historians, and they started almost immediately after the war. During the war, you could see Lincoln's own words. That's why they lean on this noble righteous cause, as they called it then. But the righteous cause was to keep the Union together.
Right.
It was not to abolish slavery, and the abolition of slavery as the forcefully reunited nation at the time, started to kind of lick its wounds. It was pretty badly damaged.
Then they realized how
they had to. It was so damaging. They had to lean on the slavery narrative, which
they had to use the emotive, the emotional narrative, because it was politically. It's all political then, and it fits right into Marxist theology. It fits right into Marxism. They believe everything is political and power. They must have that power. They must have an emotional trick, and that's why they use oppressor versus the oppressed. Now it's the same crap.
Yes,
it's just and that's recycled in your freaking.
The oppressor-oppressed narrative is exactly why you see such attitudes towards the history of it then. I'm not defending slavery or anything like that at
No,
all.
no, slavery bad. We get it. Hello.
But yeah, the modern cultural Marxist narrative is oppressor oppressed. It was considered righteous and all this kind of stuff. But, you know, following the war, you know, the northern whites, which were overwhelmingly white, you can look at the census of 1860 and see that they didn't want black folks coming up there. It wasn't about it wasn't about this egalitarian.
No, it's about labor. They didn't want black people, you know, they didn't want black massive millions of blacks coming up there and taking all the jobs. They hated the blacks.
Not just slaves, free and slave in the, you know,
and you know, Lincoln himself wanted the blacks to freaking go somewhere else, go to Liberia. I mean, this whole thing, and you will never hear Chris Plante or Glenn Beck or one of these nitwits. Look, I like them for the most part, but man, they're wrong on this.
Well,
ever about Lincoln being an actual racist.
They won't allow it.
But no, he's the great emancipator. He freed the slave, you know, and all this other horse dung. It's a lie.
It is a lie. It would be one thing if they asserted that, but were at least fair enough to point out the irrevocable damage he did to the Constitution. And the two indemnification acts Congress had to pass after the fact to legalize retroactively all the laws and criminal things Lincoln did. They had to do it twice. And forget about the fact that he was in favor and championed the Corwin Amendment, which would have been passed if the war hadn't intervened, which would have enshrined slavery specifically and permanently unless another constitutional amendment were passed.
No, but the war was about slavery.
Right. And Lincoln's own quotes, which you can even see in the Ken Burns film, Lincoln, you know, where, you know, I would free some, I'd free some and leave other slaves, or I'd leave them all slaves. His job was to keep the Union together. There was a major financial motive there, but so when you actually just you can just look at the thing, but people will say, oh well, that must have a context that makes it what we think it is, which it doesn't, by the way. The more you look into it, which is what happened to me, you know, the more you look into it, the more there's just more stuff like that. And you know, they'll look at say the founding, you know, they'll say things like Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. The Republican Party was founded on anti-slavery. Well, you have to understand what anti-slavery meant. It was not abolitionist.
Right. Yeah.
It was a labor stance.
It was a labor stance. Yeah.
And
it's about money. It's always about money.
In the Lincoln Douglas debates themselves, Lincoln referred to the troublesome presence of free Negroes.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this stuff isn't even hidden, and it's there the whole way, the whole narrative through. But somehow in our minds, we are raised to think this must be what it is. And
that's the way they need it. That's the way they want it.
Right. And therefore, oh, he must have just been being smart. And that was just, but he says it time and time again. And it's overwhelming when you look at it, just from Lincoln himself. Forget about all the other stuff going on everywhere else with everyone else.
Who are even more extreme than Lincoln.
Right. Well, yeah. And so that's the point. And so we have this idea that this was, you know, and I'm not trying to justify slavery. You know, the whole point is it was a problem, and people think, but there was this terrible war where, if you include civilians, around 1 million people were killed, which is a very high portion of the population. It's still the bloodiest war just in military deaths in American history. You can add all the other wars together, and they don't add up to as many Americans were killed north and south, you know, in that war. And so there's a major motivation to make this thing worth something other than just reuniting things for tax reasons. You know, I mean, it's really appalling when you think about the real reasons why that were out in the open back then. You know, they wanted to, you know, and so slavery has to be, you know, and Jefferson Davis has to be the foil to Lincoln and all this.
Right.
Kind of
you
stuff.
need exactly.
There has to be a good guy and a bad guy. And so this narrative has been reinforced over time. And it didn't get really strong, and you know, until you know, a lot of people who lived during the era, whether they be veterans or just people alive during the time, started to die out. And so, you know, I don't know, about every 20 or 40 years, something like that, ever since, you know, there's a major push to kind of rewrite the history books and lean more and more in the direction of this was our, you know, penance for slavery and all this kind of stuff. And so that's the problem, is that's where it comes from, because what if it were true that this war was fought over slavery, how can, you know, what kind of evil person must you be to try and say otherwise?
Right.
You're a coward.
you're cowered into acceptance. You're into
Right.
accepting that narrative no matter what. Because if you say anything contrary, you'll be censored. You'll be taken
Yeah.
away.
You're clearly a bigot, that or you're a
which
neo-Confederate, or you're
by the
somebody.
way could still happen. You know,
Right.
I'm still waiting to get droned. You know,
right.
death by drone. But
Yeah.
so we'll join a few other select people that are probably hidden to history at this point that the United States government has already droned that are American citizens. But anyway,
one more thing on that topic,
they would love to do it to us.
Yes, I'm sure some would. But
go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. Well, just kind of my final point on that arc right there is the problem with asserting this terrible war, terrible costly war, killed lots of people, destroyed our constitutional traditions up to that point. Things were rewritten after that. I mean, the only thing they didn't do was throw away the Constitution, which is what they should have done if they wanted us to shut up about this today.
Yeah.
But the problem with asserting that this whole thing was about slavery is that you take the wrong lesson away from such a costly exercise.
Right.
You know, I mean,
it is the lesson. It is the most important lesson that you are missing. It's called the truth, the honest to God truth. And
the truth is complicated, but it's certainly, the slavery issue is ancillary to it. It really is. Slavery had its problem. It was a catalyst, you know, but you know, the real things they were fighting over, slavery was not the primary cause. People say, "Oh, it's a cause," and then they will name no other causes because that's the only one they know.
Right.
So they'll
slavery.
They're like, yeah, okay. So maybe it wasn't the cause, but it's a cause, which is how they patronize you. You know,
right? Of course, that's how they try to make you cower if you're not. You know,
but as I always point out, you know, that war would have either happened or something else would have come to a head, whether slavery were an issue or not. And what people have to start asking is, what if that's true, which it is, what were those things?
Well, you see little moments of secession already rearing up, and the same issue is always going to be faced unless there's a giant, the United States gets completely subsumed by some giant world order where it doesn't matter anymore. Well, but as long as there's a few free people left, even though it's like Texas are using it political advantage as well, because if they were really serious, they put full out troops on there and kick every federal agent out of that state. That's their state. That's their property. It does not belong to the federal government.
That's right.
Period. And that's the issue. Texas has its own people and citizens. They have their own property, their own assets. The federal government has zero business there.
They are
and the fact is that the federal government's interest in the Biden administration, so on, their interest is to get people across that border.
Right.
They want these people in here and as illiterate and as dependent as possible. So they can, there's so many reasons for this. But that's sort of another topic, so we won't get into that. But it does have an effect on the, where you see this today popping up and happening, and that's an example.
The period immediately following the so-called Civil War, whereas Lincoln had argued that states were like counties, the federal government proceeded to continue to treat them like counties, and a lot of the states began to act like counties.
Right.
So instead of being sovereign political bodies, distinct political communities, they began getting in bed with the federal government. And through the Progressive era and through the New Deal era, a lot of overlap there. And up to the modern day, the states have become intertwined. Federal highway money, all these things.
Right.
These
right.
ways that,
it's basically on a bribery on a lot.
Yeah,
scale.
and just think of
that's
all
what it is.
Think of all the federal programs that even local counties take advantage of, and they kind of depend on to run their counties. And so they go and they engage in these federal programs. So
education, and then they zeroed in on education.
The tentacles kind of weave into everywhere.
And once the tentacles get in there, you cannot get rid of them.
Yeah, and you cut them, and all of a sudden you'd have, without some, methodical disengagement, which would take time, you would have counties all of a sudden becoming insolvent. It's not right, but they have legally been taking advantage of many programs where they allocate money for one reason, but then it goes into their general treasury and they spend it on whatever they want, and it helps balance their budgets to an extent.
Well, right. They just
and that
basically,
happens a lot.
shoot, we're going to pay for our pet peeve project, but we're going to use
the $8 million
money.
Clark County was going to use to build an overpass for the Appalachian Trail. They don't have $8 million to do that, or maybe it wasn't 8 million, but it was several million that they don't have.
We saw it firsthand with the Clark County battle when we went actually to a hearing in front of the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah,
and I sat there and pointed out where they were gonna take money, federal money that they had already line itemed to redesign the courthouse grounds. So that's another story again. But this happens on it is the federal influence, the federal money is a massive bribery scheme that has been it's been almost from the get-go, but it's like
it's like taking your food stamp money and using it to build a deck on your house. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. Or to buy liquor and cigarettes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're prohibited from doing that, but that's a valid comparison though. On
or
that,
to buy Cheetos, for God's sake.
Yeah. I don't know. That's probably
whatever
considered okay, but yeah, the point is it's a federal program that they claim money for one reason, and then they use it for whatever they want. And the states do it, the counties within the states do it, and maybe it serves some good somewhere along the line, but it's not. It's a backdoor way of getting these things done. It's not upfront.
People used to take care of their own. The churches and the towns and the small towns and communities and whatever. They used to take care. If somebody was struggling, if somebody was hurt, if somebody was elderly, if someone was down on their luck in whatever way, you would see people helping them, taking the steps necessary to make sure that those people are okay for the most part.
Certainly, yeah.
And you still see that sometimes. You still see neighbors helping neighbors, and it's an amazing thing that it can actually still be that way.
I think sorry, go ahead.
If you needed a teacher, a local teacher, to teach math and English and science and so on, reading and writing and spelling, you could, that teacher would be excellent at it, and you didn't need federal money. If you just had they built small schools, they did them in the churches, so there is, I still think, you hear about homeschooling and other organizations that are trying to recreate that because the public school systems are so bad. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that, or the military now. It's just every institution, and these Republicans defend the military, defend all this stuff, these patriotic things, and it sounds good, but it's on false shifting sand. It's wrong.
And I would say many of them genuinely believe it, they
believe it. Or they don't want to not believe it.
Well,
they're afraid. They're really afraid. They know something doesn't feel right in their heart and their conscience.
Yeah.
But they don't know any other way.
Right.
And so that's what's so hard to get their head around.
Yeah. Everything functions so differently than what we assume, that when we hear about it functioning badly, we think that somehow there's corruption going on, when, there may be, but that's the way it's been going for a century. This is the way it actually runs. That's the problem. They think, how did they get away with that? It's like, it was designed to do that. It's not, and it's not just status quo stuff. I mean, one way or another, these systems have kind of fallen into these patterns over more than a century. Probably, I mean, I would say at least since Wilson, probably starting at the time of Lincoln, because, we could go back to the internal improvements issue before the war, but now internal improvements are totally normal.
Right.
Whereas back then they were appalling. Like, that was a big controversial thing.
Yeah. Well, there were many warnings from the conservatives, the real conservatives, about the dangers of that, dangers of these internal improvements where the federal government would fund a corporate entity to come in and build a canal or a road or a railroad or something.
Yep.
But therein lies the problem. You cannot. Later on in the 20th century, you had that defined as actual fascism, where you had corporations and the federal government, the central government, being married up on activities, within the state to help the state, so to speak. And it really wasn't to help people. I mean, they say it was, and maybe it did to a small degree. It certainly sounded good, but it really helped the state. It's just building this massive corporate entity that just won't stop.
Yeah. Well, the problem with fascism is the same problem as socialism. The only things that culturally have staying power are things that are based on, I mean, they can be based on natural law and all that kind of thing, but natural law has a tendency to, amongst modern and I certainly am into that kind of thing, but people who forward natural law theory, that's all fine and good, but the problem is natural law theory itself can't be functional in the abstract any more than fascism or socialism, because really there's a cultural inheritance, a way people do things that kind of stick around.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? And anything that comes around has to somewhat conform to that, so you just can't have a great idea without some way it connects to the way people understand their traditions, their all these. And I'm not talking about, the tradition of, putting up a Christmas tree or something like that. I'm talking about the traditions of accountancy, legal traditions, the precedents that have gone back even into British common law from the American perspective. When we think about freedom and, self-ownership, freedom of the individual, all the rights espoused in the Bill of Rights, for example, and others, those all go back to centuries of cultural heritage, tradition, really experimentation, getting things right and wrong, casting off the bad tyrants, all that kind of stuff. You can't just come up with a new system that says we should do things this way without it being filtered through that. And that's what people don't realize. I used to be, early on, pretty just kind of straight modern conservative Republicans, the Republican, like the Republicans we're complaining about right now.
Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
I mean, Rush Limbaugh's in that same vein. Yeah.
Yep.
Or was.
Exactly. I used to like G. Gordon Liddy a lot, but he was, I think, a bit better than a lot of the rest, which for reasons I'll get into some other time, but still. And then, I was like, clearly a lot of these, conservatives really aren't into freedom as much as they should be. So I became very libertarian, and very into pure natural law theory, which is very good and really does jive well with Western traditions, especially the Anglo-American ones, legally speaking, in a lot of, I would say, and some people might argue with this, I would say in most major ways. The problem is, your straight libertarians, do it sterilely without taking into account, they think and a lot of modern Republicans do this. They think America is just an idea that anybody can, any culture can just embrace, but they can't just embrace it, without it being filtered through their traditions. You know what I mean? It won't have any staying power. It'll just be another oppressive belief system, and that's my point. It works well for us in the United States because, natural law theory works. I mean, think about it. It's the Western, from, Aristotle to, Aquinas, Thomas More, Thomas Jefferson, and others, a lot of this natural law theory has been filtered through this great Western tradition. And then furthermore, through many of our more local traditions, like the Anglo-American one, for example. And even going down further through a lot of the religious traditions. So in the West, we cope with this idea of natural law very well as it's described in the abstract, though even then it still doesn't exist in the abstract. It's still filtered through our traditions. And
culture and
yeah.
No, and we had but again, that's what's so sad. Getting back to like conservative talk radio heads, and they're basically putting down the Confederate thing, but the Confederate side, the South, had its own values, traditions, its culture, its heritage, and it persists strongly. But they don't realize they're abetting the destruction of it.
Yes, they are.
Under false pretenses, under really purely just political reasons. So they're willing to sacrifice it. And then they turn around and they say, oh, I lived in Alabama for 3 years. I lived in Texas, or
Right.
no, and I was crap, so I lived in the South.
Right. And
So I know, you don't.
Yeah. Right.
You don't know what the,
Yeah.
and then you sit there and turn around and you put down, because you bring up the slavery thing. And I keep coming up with Chris Plante. He actually said that, but of course he's doing it through the nice, comfortable spot of being high and mighty and bad mouthing the modern Democrat Party, which of course is left wing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And trying to connect that to the old Democrat Party.
Right.
By saying, like in the 20s or 30s, whatever. Yeah, the Democrat Party, that's the party of lynchings and hanging black men from trees and all this other stuff.
Well,
and it's like, it's the most demonic thing. And even, yes,
sure.
there were aspects of truth, but that's a political gimmick. Not.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was going to say, though, on icing on that cake, we need to do an episode on how Jim Crow started in the North, by the way.
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
Topic for another day, but
of course.
But yeah, and how the first pro-slavery writing started in Massachusetts, and slavery carried on there longer than almost anywhere else. In fact, probably longer than anywhere else. But yeah, story for another day. So if you're going to talk about the truth, the real context of slavery, you realize not only is it complicated, it doesn't hold the place most people think it does. But there's another topic we might want to get into a little bit.
Yeah.
Another angle on this thing where you hear a lot, people say, even lawyers, and I've even heard anecdotes of, former Supreme Court Justice Scalia saying this about various topics, where they'll say something like, the war decided that.
Right. Meaning 1865, meaning the war,
the so-called Civil War
between the states,
that.
what we say, the War of Southern Independence, decided this. So
right.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. What they're saying is conflict, the actual domination of one society over another society, actually decided these issues empirically. I think they mostly mean it decided it legally, which it certainly did, but it didn't resolve any of the issues. And that's why they're still with us today.
Right.
And so the idea that the war could solve anything is to say that might makes right.
Right.
And that's a medieval idea, and it's the medieval idea of the right of the stronger. Whereas if you had a dispute, you could challenge someone to a duel as a knight, and and they'd put you and you could have trial by combat, for example.
Right.
That was a way you could legally resolve a legal issue in the Middle Ages, and they would basically put you in a ring with somebody who would kill you with a sword, and it would said, well, the Lord, put all of us in this situation, put you in this situation. And so because this stronger person that you were paired up with,
well, you don't even need to be in a duel.
No, my whole point is the idea is if you were bigger and stronger, you defeated someone weaker, that made you right in
you were right.
Everything. It's not just that you were more skilled or stronger.
That settled
right.
That you were right. So the point is,
which we know it doesn't. Which we know it doesn't.
Because if there's a really big guy and you're just out there fighting, and you have a piece of truth or something that's right, but that person wants to cover it up, and so they overwhelm you and beat the crap out of you.
Yeah,
just because they beat you doesn't make you right. They're
right. The idea again being physical domination determines subjects of debate. You know what I mean? That is the premise there. People don't realize it, and it's ridiculous. It is completely ridiculous. And this is, of course, gradually was taken apart through.
Well, that's what happened. That's what we believe, especially in the South.
Yeah,
the people that have a strong sympathetic and attachment, I mean, and always to the Confederate cause. Get the demonization crap out of your head.
Well, I wouldn't call it.
But the party of Lincoln, the Union Army, did not, for the most part, outfight the Confederate Army, but through absolute overwhelming resources,
they outlasted them.
The bigger entity won out, and the surrender was probably eventually inevitable.
Yeah, they outlasted them. They just outlasted them. That's all they had to do.
That does not. I know it's hard for people to get their head around that. That does not make them right. That does not make that cause right. And so that's how what you're saying. People like a conservative justice, Scalia, who was a great justice on many counts. But he defaults back to this. Well, the war settled it. That's what he's talking about. Or the 14th Amendment. Well, there was still the 10th Amendment. So the 10th Amendment doesn't really apply anymore. Unfortunate reason is, according to the Supreme Court and a lot of so-called legal scholars, the 14th Amendment and the supremacy clause and all that, you don't have a 10th Amendment anymore. You may have it as an amendment on paper, but it's no longer a forcible.
Right. And
it's no longer a power of force.
And it wasn't specifically repealed either, but the effects of subsequent amendments have made it much less effective.
Yeah.
It had no teeth, and it really had no teeth, I think probably in one of the biggest ways, when the 17th Amendment was passed and the senators were, instead of being appointed by the states and therefore working for the states, they were popularly elected.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So people have to look into that. I think there's so many other topics. We're always struggling for topics because there's so many, not because there's too few, but there's so many.
Which one's most
and I've wanted to do this so-called conservative talk radio media personalities. You know, they do these books, even like, Bill O'Reilly, the old Bill O'Reilly. Which he's gone now pretty much, but
well, he's got his online platform, but he might still be writing ridiculous books.
And if you
he's not a historian either.
And if you ever recognize, there's nobody like our side of things anywhere near the public debate. Only Judge Napolitano had Brian McClanahan on.
Well, and
there's nobody out there. If you notice, every single one of them have solidified around this idea of this mantra of the Civil War. That's where we stopped. That's where the Confederate bad, slavery,
and that's really where our nation started now.
And that's where
our nation started there.
Everything.
And in a way, they're kind of right. It was kind of
they are right.
They're kind of right. It was kind of our French Revolution. That's where everything changed fundamentally. The Constitution was not discarded, but they started treating it completely differently.
Yeah, that's why they say we're lost cause, and that's just the lost cause. They're thinking of it in terms of no. In our opinion, no, it's not lost. It never was lost. We are the true freedom-loving Americans. We're the ones who believed in.
Go ahead.
And the sovereignty of states. We didn't believe in a Supreme Court should rule over state Supreme Courts unless there's a specific violation of the Constitution. And usually that was between two states fighting, not between, the Supreme Court just wills it or judges it so to be. That's not how the system was supposed to work.
Right. Well,
and that's what you see.
And there's evidence of that. There's Jefferson's letters with the Danbury Baptists, for one. And that was the idea. The whole point is, and this is really hard for people to get their heads around because it seems so counterintuitive, but it was actually true, and it's evidenced by probably not to this only one, but it's the biggest one that I'm familiar with, which is the Danbury Baptist case, where the Massachusetts government was basically saying, "Hey, Danbury Baptist Church, you're not allowed to be a Baptist church in our state. We're going to be something else, and we're going to tell you can't be that." And they started screaming bloody murder, which they were right to do, and they wrote Jefferson, and Jefferson wrote him back saying, "Look, I feel sorry for you, and I agree that you should be able to do what you want, but the federal government has no power to stop Massachusetts from doing what it wants." And that was how it used to operate. And just last week, Hawaii told the Supreme Court to go pound sand on gun control. Now, I'm not a fan of gun control, and Hawaii is, but they basically said, "We don't care what you say." you know?
Yeah. And so it's up to the states. And I go back to this, and then we'll sort of close out on this one. But you know, the states can do what they want. The states should be able to do what they want.
Right.
The federal government should not have overarching power for everything as we have today.
Mm-hmm.
It was never intended to be this way. And all of the ills that you're seeing, your freaking money going right out the door to Ukraine. That's really the end result of it. That's
Right.
where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
That is what's happened. And,
Well,
you know, if Massachusetts or Hawaii wants to go full on liberal and freaking, you know, allow meth and sex with dogs, let them. You go crazy, you go freaking nuts. That, you know, we said this before, but you know, we in you know, say South Carolina or Virginia or whatever, we don't want that. You know, you go right ahead and go crazy. That's fine.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Everybody take our nut bags with you. Go right the hell ahead.
Yep.
But just
Yep.
leave us the hell alone. That's what this has
Amen.
always been about.
Yeah.
So,
well, and it doesn't. And one more thing, real quick,
Yeah,
you don't
go ahead.
have to be specifically, however they might term it, sympathetic to the Confederate history or anything like that. If you are just a fan of American originalism,
Right.
you know, it's the exact same thing. It really is. And the more you research the history, the more obvious that becomes.
And it's all there. And we'll have a gentleman on here soon that who has a tremendous love and incredibly scholarly historical credence because he has so many original source documents from the archives, and it is unreal. And and it'll open your eyes. And you know, so anyway, we've got some good shows coming up, but I think we can end this one here.
Sure.
So thanks. I wanted to give you can't probably see the hat, but Valhalla Stables. Just wanted to mention them again.
Winchester, Virginia.
I think it's Valhalla Stables .com. Valhalla Stables. Anyway, so appreciate their friendship. And so remember to like the podcast. Go ahead and be one of our followers on YouTube. That's where we are until YouTube decides to completely censor us. You can still find us there. We're also on Rumble as well. So check us out. It's at American Reckoning Podcast on YouTube. And but anyway, you search that on Rumble, you can find us as well. So all right. Anything else? We good?
Good to go, man.
All right, man. Hey, take care.